Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is visiting the United States. It is the first time he has left the country since the war began in February this year. He will meet US President Joe Biden and also address the US Congress. Zelensky will meet Biden at the White House, where Biden is expected to announce a new military aid package for Ukraine. Washington is already the largest supplier of aid to Kiev. It has provided assistance worth $50 billion since the war began. Reports say another reason for Zelensky's visit is to convince Biden to keep the aid flowing. While the US publicly keeps backing Ukraine, there are concerns about American military supplies running low. Fears of escalating the conflict are also reportedly prompting Biden to exercise caution. It isn't just the US, though. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has reportedly ordered an audit. He wants to know how significant and effective British assistance has been. The UK is the second largest supplier of aid to Ukraine. Reports suggest Zelensky needs to convince Ukraine's allies that the war can be won. Otherwise, the voices urging Ukraine to negotiate a peace deal will get louder. But earlier on Wednesday, the Kremlin said it saw no chance for peace talks with Ukraine, and it called any additional aid from the United States an aggravation of the conflict. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin attended a meeting of Russia's military chiefs. He spoke in a confident tone about Russia's progress in Ukraine and the exhaustion of Western military stocks.
Хорошо известно, что сегодня против России активно используется военный потенциал и возможности практически всех основных стран НАТО. Тем не менее, наши солдаты, сержанты и офицеры сражаются за Россию мужественно и стойко. Уверенно, шаг за шагом решают поставленные задачи. И эти задачи...
Russia plans to completely control the 4 Ukrainian territories it annexed. It has suffered setbacks and currently does not control any of these territories in their entirety. But it has plans to make the occupied territories functional. The defense minister has said Russia plans to base ships in the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, which are now fully functional, according to him. Putin spoke about future arms supplies to Russian forces. These include hypersonic and intercontinental missiles. He also spoke about how he plans to protect Russia's sovereignty.
И все это должно быть тщательно проанализировано, использовано для строительства наших, как я уже говорил, вооруженных сил, продолжать поддерживать боеготовность и совершенствовать боеготовность ядерной триады. Это главная гарантия сохранения нашего суверенитета и территориальной целостности, стратегического паритета, в целом баланса сил в мире.
So Russia is planning to develop its nuclear arsenal. Ukraine does not seem to want to negotiate. And the West keeps supplying Ukraine with arms despite their dwindling stocks. In this situation, Zelensky's US visit may actually prolong the war. For more on this story, we're now joined by Adam Schwartz. He is a writer and political commentator. Welcome to WION. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, President Zelensky's visit to the US is being keenly watched. Even though President Biden has reaffirmed his support to Ukraine time and again, there are some concerns about how much longer the West would be able to sustain this war. There are those in the US who are not particularly happy with all the aid that's going to Ukraine. The UK Prime Minister, as we just mentioned, Rishi Sunak, has reportedly ordered an audit. Is it now only a matter of time before the West urges Ukraine to negotiate a peace deal with Russia? Or do you believe Zelensky can convince them to keep the aid pouring in?
Well, I think, that's really the main task of Zelensky in Washington. I mean, I think, when the eventual history of this conflict is written, President Zelensky's visit to Washington will be considered one of the most sort of iconic moments. It obviously is sort of steeped in symbolism for several reasons, mostly in kind of solidifying the US-Ukraine alliance. Of course, it's symbolic in the sense that it's Zelensky's first foreign trip outside, so it represents, great advancements in Ukrainian security. But I think, Zelensky really has very practical view of what this trip is actually meant to achieve. And of course, I would very much expect Biden and Zelensky to present a very sort of unified approach, certainly in public. But I think behind closed doors, you're going to see a huge amount of quite tense discussions over exactly what Ukraine wants. Ukraine is enduring a situation where it's having to, regularly absorb heavy and regular bombardments from Russian forces. It's preparing for a new offensive from Russia in the spring. And it's also preparing its own counteroffensive to try to retake some of the land that Russia is currently occupying to the east. So we know that Ukraine has been asking, and it continues to ask, for certain military equipment to try to facilitate its protection and also to try to regain some of that land. So I think in terms of Zelensky's top priorities, of course, it will be the US Patriot missile defense system, which Biden is expected to announce. But also Zelensky's asking for longer range artillery, but also modern tanks. And I think as you correctly mentioned, the West is becoming sort of increasingly reluctant to want to escalate this war. But I think there's also a recognition that in the West that actually there's only so much that Ukraine can do in terms of trying to negotiate with Russia. And ultimately, Ukraine has made it very clear that, its negotiation position is that all Russian forces must leave what it considers to be Ukrainian territory. And so, really, if Russia is not considering any positions even close to that, it's very difficult to see at the moment how a negotiated settlement could actually happen. But I think, Zelensky has a difficult task in the US, because at the moment we've seen about a third of voters currently want to stop providing support to Ukraine. That's a fall from about 20% of voters back in February, March when the war began. So I think Zelensky's opportunity later today when he's speaking to Congress will be an opportunity not only to speak to American political leaders but also to the public as well, because we know that ultimately in America political leaders are accountable to their base. So I think that's particularly important in terms of what Zelensky is trying to achieve from this particular trip.
Absolutely. And you're right. The mood seems to be shifting. And while I understand the point that you're making about how this visit is steeped in symbolism, at the end of the day, what Zelensky is able to take home with him is what is going to determine how successful this visit has really been. But let me ask you this. The Kremlin has clearly said there is no chance for peace talks with Ukraine. It has also said any additional aid from the US would be seen as an aggravation of the conflict. At the same time, Ukraine does not seem to want to negotiate with Putin. So the question is, how long is this war likely to really go on for? It is, after all, a very expensive war for the entire world, as we've seen with spiraling energy prices and the soaring cost of living everywhere.
Well, I think unfortunately, it is a situation that could theoretically go on for years. If both sides are so far apart in terms of what they want their objectives to be, then it's very difficult to see how this could be resolved through anything other than sort of military conquest. And I think, even though there are obviously major pressures on the Western side in terms of providing financial and defensive and civilian assistance to Ukraine due to domestic economic issues in the West resulting from both the war and from COVID, I do think there will be sustained support for Ukraine. And I think you'll also see continued improvements in the kind of weapons that the West will provide to Ukraine, because ultimately, the West knows that any kind of military defeat in Ukraine would be considered such a sort of catastrophic blow to the morale of Western democracies. Because, as far as the West is concerned, this is a military invasion, it's a war of aggression, and it's completely unjustified. And so really, the West is unwilling to try to envisage a situation where, Ukraine would not be able to defend itself in this situation. On the Russian side, we have, quite a difficult and a different situation where Putin has very much sort of stoked his political survival on the success of this war. And even this afternoon, when he was addressing military leaders, insisted that Russia would reach its strategic objectives in Ukraine. And so, it's very difficult to see the way that, Putin can actually climb down from this. Commentators often talk about providing Russia with a a way out of the situation that can provide Putin with some kind of victory that he could present to the Russian people. But, his objectives are so contrary to anything that both the West and Ukraine could accept. It's very difficult to see how this would happen. So I think it's perfectly possible that, as say, it could go on for years. But I think, one possibility is there may be some kind of domestic political change in Russia. But I think, we're certainly quite a way away from that, because we've seen still quite a lot of support for Putin from both the public and from the military.
Right. And as we know, President Zelensky is going to meet with President Joe Biden at the White House, following which he will also address the U.S. Congress. Therefore, perhaps it would be safe to say how strong a case Zelensky can make while he addresses the U.S. Congress and the U.S. President for continuing support for this war is perhaps going to be the biggest test for him as far as the success or otherwise of this visit is concerned. On that note, Adam Schwartz, thank you very much for speaking to WION.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.